All right, let's jump right in. Today we're looking at sex work in Taiwan, and it's a fascinating but also really tough situation. We're talking about a place where, for decades, huge fights over laws, risk, and what's right or wrong have pushed tens of thousands of people into this really dangerous legal gray area.
So just imagine this for a second. What if your job was technically legal, but doing it could land you in jail? I mean, it sounds completely contradictory, right? But that is the confusing reality for thousands upon thousands of workers in Taiwan. The law says one thing, but what actually happens on the street? That's a whole different story. It creates this constant state of uncertainty, of risk. So, who are the people actually caught in the middle of this whole mess?
Okay, so before we dive into all the legal jargon and the politics, let's just start with the people themselves. Let's try to look past the headlines, past the stereotypes, and really get a sense of who we're talking about here.
You know, the term sex worker is actually way broader than most people think. We're talking about men, women, transgender people. They can be heterosexual, homosexual, asexual, really the whole spectrum. And some do it full-time, others part-time. The work itself is also super diverse. It could be direct services like intercourse or BDSM, but it also includes things like erotic massage, just providing companionship, or even creating content online. But here's the absolute key. The one thing that has to be constant, and what separates this from something like human trafficking, we are always talking about consenting adults.
Because this all happens in an illegal market, workers are exposed to just huge risks. Theft is a huge one. Clients get really creative about not paying. For example, they might book for an hour, then convince the worker to stay longer, and only then reveal they don't have the money to pay for the extra time. And honestly, theft is often the least of their problems.
So that brings up a really critical question, right? If you're a victim of a crime, say you're robbed or even assaulted, can you call the police? And this is where it gets really twisted. The answer is, well, you can, but if you do, you risk getting arrested yourself. It's this impossible choice. Do you report the crime and risk your own freedom, or do you just stay silent?
And when you look at who actually gets punished, this inequality just becomes crystal clear. Think about it. The most vulnerable workers, the ones on the street, they only make up a tiny fraction of the whole industry. But get this, they account for a staggering 85 to 90% of all the arrests. It's just wild.
Yeah, this chart just lays the injustice out perfectly. You can see the huge gap right there. The most vulnerable workers make up maybe 15% of the total, but they carry almost 90% of the arrests. And why? Well, it's just much easier for police to go after, say, an older worker in a small motel than it is to raid some high-end hotel. So what happens in practice is that the law ends up punishing the most powerless people in the system.
Okay, so how on earth did Taiwan end up with a system that creates so much danger and is so unfair? Well, the answer is kind of fascinating. It's all rooted in this completely contradictory law that was passed more than a decade ago.
All right, so here's the law. It's called the Special Zone Law. The idea was that the government would approve these specific regulated districts, these special zones. And inside those zones, sex work would be totally legal. Outside of them, though, illegal for everyone. And, you know, on paper, it sounds like a decent compromise, right? A way to control the industry and maybe even protect the workers. But there's a huge, fatal flaw.
And here it is. The number of official special zones that have actually been created since this law was passed? 0. Zilch. Not a single one. So think about what that means. Sex work is technically legal, but only in these imaginary places that don't exist, which means, by default, it's illegal.
So you have to ask, why? Why did this idea fail so spectacularly? Well, it was almost designed to. First, the rules for where you could even put a zone are so strict that it's nearly impossible in a place as dense as Taiwan. Second, anytime a location is suggested, you get this massive not-in-my-backyard protest from residents who are worried about crime or property values. Then, the licensing process is so complicated that it pretty much shuts out independent or part-time workers. And on top of all that, the law only covers direct sex acts, totally ignoring all these other forms of sex work we talked about. It's just a completely unworkable system from top to bottom.
But a broken law like this doesn't just happen by accident. To really get why this exists, we need to zoom out a bit.
we need to look at a really fierce, deep-seated ideological battle that has been shaping how we talk about sex for decades. And that battle is often called the feminist sex wars. So here's a super quick history tour. You had the first wave of feminism, mostly fighting for the right to vote. Back then, they generally saw prostitution as degrading. But then came the second wave, in the 60s and 70s, and that's when a huge split happened, right over the issues of pornography and sex. This is what kicked off the sex wars. And honestly, that debate is still going on today. It's just evolved through the third and fourth waves, which bring in ideas about intersectionality, digital feminism, and the role the government should play in all this.
Okay, so during that second wave, two main camps really formed. On one side, you have anti-pornography feminists. Their argument, in a nutshell, is that the entire sex industry is fundamentally a form of male violence against women. You might know their famous slogan, "Pornography is the theory, rape is the practice." Then on the other side, you have sex radical feminists. They argue that no, sex itself isn't the problem. The real problem is society's repressive and controlling rules about sex. For them, exploring different kinds of sexual expression is actually a powerful tool for liberation.
This is where the politics get really, really interesting and kind of strange. If you look at this chart, you see that both feminist camps are against traditional patriarchy, obviously. But some of the anti-pornography feminists ended up in what people call an unholy alliance with moral conservatives. Now, their reasons are totally different, right? But they ended up sharing the same goal, basically policing sexuality.
And there's a name for this. Sociologist Elizabeth Bernstein calls it carceral feminism. It's this idea that you solve social problems by using the criminal justice system. More police, more arrests, more prisons. So instead of focusing on things like social welfare or actually empowering workers, the solution just becomes punishment. And the irony is, this can end up doing more harm to the very people it's supposed to be protecting.
Okay, so let's bring this all back to actual policy. How does this big ideological fight translate into real laws? Well, right now, around the world, there are basically four main ways that societies are trying to regulate sex work.
Let's run through them. First, you've got prohibition. Super simple. Makes everything about sex work illegal. Goal, to get rid of it completely. Then there's regulation, which is that special zone model that Taiwan tried and that failed. The goal there is to contain and control it. Third is the Nordic model. This one is interesting. It makes it illegal to buy sex but not to sell it. The idea is to crush the demand. And finally, you have decriminalization. This is what places like New Zealand do. It basically treats sex work like any other job, takes it out of the criminal code, and puts it under labor law. The main goal here is all about worker safety, health, and rights.
So, as you can see, the debate in Taiwan, and really all over the world, is nowhere near finished. It's stuck right between these big ideas and the messy reality of making policy. And as all these arguments keep going, they really force us to ask one fundamental question. When you strip away all the theories and all the politics, what does true safety and real dignity actually look like for the human beings at the very center of all this?